We're going to start in with watching a little excerpt of a video from a series called The Bible Project. Those of you who've done stuff online with us before will know we use this from time to time. And it's a neat little introduction to at least part of the wisdom literature and the some of the books that we'll be looking at. So we'll start with that.
There are 3 books in the Bible that have come to be called the wisdom literature: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job.
And all of these books are addressing the same set of questions. What kind of world are we living in? And what does it look like to live well in this world?
So, how to be good at life.
Yeah. So each of these books tackles these questions from a unique perspective, and it's important to understand all of them to get a fully biblical perspective on the good life. So as a thought experiment, you could actually imagine each of these books as a person. So Proverbs would be like this brilliant young teacher, and Ecclesiastes the sharp middle-aged critic, and Job would be this weathered old man who's seen a lot in his day.
We're going to start by meeting the book of Proverbs, the brilliant young teacher. And she's not just smart, she's smart about everything: work, relationships, sex, spirituality. She has incredible insights, things you wouldn't see on your own.
Yeah, she would be the perfect friend to have around when you need really specific advice.
So what makes her so smart?
Well, Proverbs can see things that most people don't see. She believes that there's an invisible creative force in the universe that can guide people in how they should live. And you can't see it, just like you can't see gravity, but it affects everything that we do.
So what's this force?
Well, in Hebrew, it's called chokhmah, and it usually gets translated into English as wisdom. It's an attribute of God that God used to create the world. And chokhmah has been woven into the fabric of things and how they work. So wherever people are making good or just or wise decisions, they're tapping into chokhmah.
And whenever someone's making a bad decision, they're working against chokhmah.
Right, or as it says in Proverbs chapter 1, the waywardness of fools will destroy them, but the one who listens to wisdom lives in security.
So it's like a moral law of the universe.
Yeah, it's a cause-effect pattern, and no one can escape it. And Proverbs personifies all of this as a woman.
Yeah, Lady Wisdom.
Right, and she roams around the earth, calling out, making herself available to anyone who's willing to listen to her and to learn. Which leads to the second thing Proverbs believes: that anyone can access and interact with wisdom and use it to make a beautiful life for yourself or for others.
You can create with it like a designer.
Yes, in fact, chokhmah in Hebrew isn't simply intellectual knowledge. The word is also used to describe a skilled artisan who excels at their craft, like woodworking or stonemasonry. So you show you possess chokhmah when you put it to work and develop the skill of making a good life.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's do this. Let's go find some wisdom.
But before you do, Proverbs has one more really important thing to consider. Chokhmah isn't some impersonal force. It's an attribute of God himself. And so in Hebrew thought, your journey to becoming wise has to begin with what Proverbs calls the fear of the Lord. It's this healthy respect for God's definition of good and evil. And true wisdom means learning those boundary lines and not crossing them.
Now, all those ideas you just unpacked are in chapters 1 through 9 in Proverbs. But when I think of the book of Proverbs, I think of the collection of sayings, the Proverbs themselves. Tell me about those.
Yeah, those are...
Okay, that's the introduction to chokhmah, wisdom. We're going to come back to Proverbs in subsequent weeks and look at various excerpts from it. So we're not going to dig into that now. But the video is just introducing us to the biblical idea of wisdom. We're going to look at a couple of passages now and then start thinking about what they mean for us. This is what we've already had in our prayer and seen in the video. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And a little bit later, this is where, a little bit later in chapter 1, this is where we get the beginning of the identification of wisdom as the woman, as was shown in the video. Wisdom cries out in the street, in the squares, she raises her voice. At the busiest corner, she cries out. At the entrance of the city gates, she speaks. Wisdom is not just something for personal, private, secluded meditation. Wisdom has a public role, a public ministry. Does not wisdom call, we read in chapter 8 of Proverbs. Does not understanding raise her voice? Those of you who've done the Old Testament course will recognize that's already a parallelism. Wisdom calling, understanding raising her voice, just in that one line there. Does not wisdom call? Does not understanding raise her voice? On the heights, beside the way, at the crossroads, she takes her stand. Beside the gates in front of the town, at the entrance of the portals, she cries out. So Proverbs is shaped around wisdom. And there's a depiction of Lady Wisdom. So we're going to go straight into breakout rooms. Is that right, Elizabeth?
Yes, we're going to go into breakout rooms and we're going to consider these questions. Now, you might like to jot them down or commit them to memory. They're not difficult. Just thinking about what struck you about these verses and the portrayal of wisdom you saw in the verses or in the little video. And what concepts do you think they're attempting to convey in this portrayal of wisdoms?
And probably the first minute or so of your group should be just introducing yourself briefly to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, what strikes you about this portrayal and what do you think Proverbs is trying to say about this figure of wisdom, or the little video as you watched it reflecting that? So I'm going to pop you all into breakout rooms now. Hopefully there won't be a problem with that. And we will give you, not 60 minutes, I'll change that. And we'll give you a few minutes to think about that. Don't forget to join the rooms. Okay, good people. What have you think you've discovered about wisdom, or you think you know about wisdom from your groups? Anything you'd like to share?
Well, could we, our group, well, I'd like to actually understand from you, Elizabeth, we were discussing the word fear and we're wondering, basically, has the word fear been changed that we see as terror, maybe in our society? Did the word fear mean something slightly different in the Hebrew language?
Yes, it is. It means awe or reverence.
Oh, right. So we were good.
Yeah, we got that, didn't we?
Exactly.
Yeah. It probably does have a slight dose of what we would think of as fear, as in scared, because, whenever God or an angel turns up, the first thing they'll say is, do not be afraid.
That's right.
So along with awe and reverence does go a bit of shaking in your boots.
Well, it's the unknown quantity, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. But it's that sense of awe and reverence and, it is unknownness or otherness or mystery or, being in the presence of the Lord, all of that.
Yeah, and we were talking about that too as being the key. Like, you won't even know wisdom is around unless there is that first, that awe, reverence, respect, whatever you like, of God, which the video so beautifully shown as interwoven, the wisdom that's interwoven into everything. So it does begin with that sense of understanding what this is about. It's about God, not about anything else, really.
Yeah.
I think our group had a question about wisdom being a woman and why it changed to men being the wife. And in it, who has been with all our former Bible studies, explained that after the translators, the men, are the ones and they put the women down.
Well, she definitely is a female. I mean, Hebrew is a language like Greek and Latin that assigns gender beyond what we do in English. In English, we give gender to things that actually have that sexuality, like male or female, whether it's an animal or a human. And anything that's not alive, we tend to say it's an it, it's neuter. But Hebrew and Latin and Greek that have biblical stuff in them are languages that assign gender to most things. So you might have a male table or a neuter cat or whatever. But in this case, it's not an accident, because all of the attributes of God that intermingle or work within humanity are all feminine. So Chokhmah is wisdom, and then we have the Shekinah, which is the glory of God. We have the Ruach, which is the spirit of God, and the Bat Kol, which is the voice of God, and every single one of them are feminine. So all of these divine characteristics that interact with humanity are all feminine, and it's not accidental.
Elizabeth,
People tell you. Sorry, Norman.
I'm just going to ask you, could you spell Chokhmah? I want to look it up in the dictionary.
Yeah, it's spelt two ways. You can find it spelt Hochma, or you can find it Chochma, Chokhmah.
Thank you very much.
I don't know if have we got it written up anywhere, John?
I was just going to have a look, but I don't think we do actually.
Yeah. And it's as I said, it's a Hebrew word. Yeah. And its Greek is translation is Sophia, which is what you can see on this slide here down the bottom. So in Greek, Chokhmah becomes Sophia, which is the Greek word for wisdom.
Right.
Thank you. So all those Greek girls in Canberra are all wise, obviously.
Yes, that's right. If they're called Sophie or Sophia, they indeed are. And that's what the word means. You don't get as many people called Chokhmah, I don't think.
Probably not.
Not as popular. So,
all right, enough of this talk about women. We're going to go on to the men now.
Thank you, John.
In Matthew's Gospel, Jesus talks about the evil and adulterous generation asking for a sign, but no sign, he says, will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. And then he talks a bit about Jonah and Nineveh. And then he says, the Queen of the South will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because she came from the ends of the earth to listen to the wisdom of Solomon. And see, something greater than Solomon is here, he says, humbly referring to himself, no doubt.
Typical male
happy-looking chap, isn't he, according to this?
Well, that's Solomon, yes. That's one portrait of Solomon looking wise, I suppose.
And
trying to.
Yes.
And so we have these Old Testament passages which talk about wisdom and knowledge being granted to Solomon. That's from the Chronicler. This is...
that's the Queen of Sheba visiting Solomon in his palace.
Yeah.
The depiction of that. Yeah, and you can see how simply and plainly he lives.
Yes.
Yes, yes. No ostentatious there.
No, nothing at all ostentatious.
All the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind, says the chronicler. And those of you who've done the Old Testament course will remember that the chronicler was writing after the return from exile and was reworking the material found in the books of Samuel and Kings, and was extolling the great things about the good old days when Israel was in charge of its own place, when Solomon was king. King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom, is the claim. Every one of the kings of the earth came and brought objects of silver, gold, garments, weaponry, spices, horses, mules, year by year. And Elizabeth's going to talk about his army, no doubt.
His large army, and his violation of Deuteronomy 17 that says that kings will not import horses from Egypt. You can see that the chronicler seems to have forgotten that, which is interesting, because he usually makes his characters stick to the rules, but not here. And Solomon, of course, raises a large army by conscripting the males from his kingdom. This is a very optimistic portrayal of Solomon here, trying to explain away his extreme wealth by saying, well, people came and just showered it upon him, rather than saying Solomon actually overtaxed his people, took away, tithed their crops and their money and took their sons and their daughters and their servants for himself so he could maintain this lifestyle.
Would you not now say he's corrupt?
Probably you would say he's corrupt. And if people were bringing him things, they were probably bribing him for some reasons.
Corrupt by our standards.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, yes, indeed, Norman. I mean, in the ancient Near East, you took what you could get. And if Solomon could get it, good on him. That's probably the way it would have been seen. And we can see here that Solomon is given very great wisdom, discernment, and the breadth of understanding. That's as vast as the sand on the seashore. So that his wisdom surpassed the wisdom of everyone, all of the East, all of Egypt, wiser than anyone else that you can possibly think of. Now, we don't know who these people are, but clearly all of them had a reputation for being wise. His fame spread. He composed 3,000 proverbs. His songs numbered 1,005. He would speak of trees. He would speak to the animals, birds, reptiles, and fish. People came from all the nations to hear the wisdom of Solomon. They came from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. So just in case you missed the point, Solomon is the wisest man and king on the planet.
So this is from the first book of Kings, which of course was written earlier than the Chronicles, because we believe that the chronicler was revising and adapting and modifying Kings. So this is an earlier attestation of Solomon's wealth and wisdom, particularly wisdom.
There he is.
Here he is in one of the Orthodox churches. He's recognised as the Holy Prophet Solomon.
He doesn't look very happy.
No, he doesn't, does he? He's very serious. He's also recognised as a holy prophet in Islam, who sees Solomon as one of the great prophets.
But you can't look happy in icons.
That's right.
Oh, that's
true.
It's a rule. All right, here we go.
We're going to hear a story because you've just heard about how Solomon was meant to be able to talk to all the birds and the trees and all the creatures and fishes, etc. And he's also credited with having a magic carpet that he flew around on and other magical things. And he has given rise to many, many stories in Jewish folklore. And they're tales usually of wisdom, cleverness, and tricks. And for those of you who've done the Midrash course with me, you'd know that Midrashim are created by the rabbis. And they become stories that are often recounted by common people about biblical characters like Solomon. And they attempt to explain things about that biblical character from where they see gaps in the text. And they often take something in the text like Solomon could talk to creatures, and they expand that and have a look at what that might mean if Solomon could talk to creatures. And this is a very short story called Solomon and the Ant. And you can see in the picture, Solomon is holding the little creature in his hand. Solomon had a magic carpet that only he could command. One day he was flying high above the earth and he was very pleased with himself. He said, "I am the greatest of all. I fly above the world. I understand all the languages of all the creatures. I can hear them speak even from this great height." At that moment, he heard a creature say, "King Solomon is not so great." Solomon looked down and saw the words had been spoken by an ant. He commanded the carpet to stop and to descend to the earth. Solomon found the tiny ant. He bent down and picked it up so he could look at it eye to eye. He said to it, "You little creature of the dust, I heard you say I am not so great. Tell me, who is greater than I?" The ant replied, I am greater than you." "How can you say that?" said Solomon. The ant answered, "I am greater than you." "What?" said Solomon. "How?" The ant replied, "I am greater than you because the greatest king in the world stopped when he heard me speak. He lowered himself to the earth and he bent down in front of me. He raised me up so we were the same height, and he asked me a question that I could answer and he could not." Solomon smiled. He said, "I am that king who stopped when you spoke and lowered himself and bent down, raised you up and asked you a question that he could not answer. You are, said the ant, and I am the creature who told you something you did not know. King Solomon gently lowered the ant back to the earth. O wise and mighty ant, you are greater than I thought you were, and I am not so great as I thought I was. I still have much to learn from my fellow creatures. And that's the end of the story of Solomon and the ant. Now, this is thought to be connected with a proverb. So if we go to the next slide, it's Proverbs 6. Go to the ant, you sluggard. Yes. Or you lazy person. Consider her ways and be wise. And it goes on to say, for she brings in her food and she puts by stuff for the harvest and she works hard doing it. I think we've got someone at the door, John. Sorry about that, good people. This is the joys of Zoom.
Do you want me to take that down, or you'll just?
Yeah, I was just, so the Talmud, this is reflecting the Talmud, which teaches us that humans can learn from everything, even from tiny ants. Who teaches us by the beasts of the earth and makes us wise by the fowls of the heaven? And had the Torah not been given to us, we would have learned modesty from the cat, avoiding seizure of others' property from the ant, avoidance of infidelity from the dove, and good manners from the rooster. I found that last one quite curious. So the rabbis connected a lot of things and coming up with these stories that reflected some of these things that they believed. And it's a story that's meant to teach a humbling lesson about the dangers of arrogance and the misuse of great wisdom and power. So I think we have a question for you. So what sort of wisdom do you think these stories of Solomon highlight, and why do you think they were so popular? Why is wisdom a thing? Because it is a big thing in the Old Testament. Why do you think this is so? Do you want to think about it in the big group, or do you want me to pop you back into your small groups?
Well, the last one, go to the ant, thou sluggard, is something that's very practical.
Yes.
Something that you would observe if you were out ploughing the field and you came across an ant's nest.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, they've obviously observed how diligent and busy and industrious your average ant is.
Doesn't it really tell us that everything has value and has knowledge, and we shouldn't count down anything?
It actually does, because another thing that's said about this story of Solomon and the ant that one of the rabbis wrote said that God, looking down from the huge height of heaven, sees the ant and the human as the same size. And that's meant to also be an equalising thing about how important humans might think they are. In God's eyes, they're not quite there.
That's right. We can't learn from anybody else.
Yes, but
Yeah.
I think too, it's that particular story is highlighting that Solomon was prepared to learn from something very tiny, prepared to learn from. I mean, the story does have him stopping and coming down to talk to the ant. So not overlooking smallness. To me, it's also, I suppose, speaking into our modern times about how important it is to listen to small things in the created world, what they are telling us.
Yeah.
So I think there's something in there about power too, that power needs to be tempered by humility or some kind of sense of communication with you know, the surroundings and the other creatures. So I don't think power's entirely bad, but it needs to be tempered. That's kind of what I'm hearing.
Yes, and the rabbis make that point about this story. It's about Solomon learning. He's flying around thinking, I am the greatest, like Muhammad Ali on his carpet. And the ant is there to teach him he's not as great as he thinks he is. So it is about power and arrogance being tempered by understanding that you may not be the most important thing on the face of the earth.
Is there any nature impact in this, in terms of the ant being a creature of the earth, dependent on the soil, etc., and this is an interaction between wisdom and the earth?
Yes, I think there is in other stories of Solomon, we find this highlighted that, you know, he's interacting with nature and he's listening to nature and he's being guided by it. And I mean, that can have a modern day lesson to us as well. I mean, we might be able to not speak the language of ants and pick one up and have a nice conversation with it. But, you know, they might be trying to tell us something. If a species is being wiped out, what is it trying to tell us?
Yeah, I'm wondering
Yes.
if that's somewhere in that story as well.
Yes, I think it is.
As a small part, Yeah.
I mean, the rabbis cross-reference it with Job, and Job has a lot of that stuff in it, as you'll discover when we get to that book.
Okay.
So I think that's right. So why do you think these stories are popular? Because they are. And I've got a whole book, and you can see me holding it up. This is Solomon and the Ant, and you can see that thick. And it's actually full of all these little 1.5-page stories about Solomon and wisdom.
Because they're pithy and easy to remember.
Yes.
And
Good
easy
answer,
to
Margaret.
understand.
Easy to understand, easy to remember. They teach a lesson without you even knowing you're learning a lesson.
Yes.
Is it also because it's talking to people who often feel that they are not important with the great, I suppose.
The great scheme.
Yeah, you've got Solomon, you know, and I'm just a poor nobody almost.
Yeah. Well, I
See,
think
there's-
that's part of it, because the human creature often thought it was the pinnacle of creation, where these stories are reminding you that it isn't.
Mm.
It's
No
almost
matter
like everyone has a part to play.
Yes. And that part is important, and you shouldn't think you're more important than someone else. Because if we didn't have ants doing certain things, what would that mean? If we didn't have flies doing certain things, what would that mean? We'd probably be, you know, up to our eyeballs in dung and refuse, and that wouldn't be good at all.
These days, bees, which are
Yeah.
quite endangered, quite threatened. Yeah.
So
When were these little stories written? The book you've got there, when were they written?
Well, that's a good question. They're very old, a lot of them. Let me have a look and see if it says.
They're probably like folklore.
Yeah.
They are folklore.
Yeah, they're a collection of stories.
And they've been around for many, many centuries. Now, whether they're as old as the Old Testament is unlikely, but they're certainly, it just says they've, and well, the Torah and the Talmud, where some of them come from, I mean, that dates almost to the time of Jesus, the Talmud.
Well, the Talmud's 5 centuries after Jesus.
Yeah.
So we're talking about ancient and medieval
Stuff, that's right. And the Mishnah was around, was that slightly later than the Talmud, John?
No, it was earlier.
Earlier.
The Mishnah was 220. The Talmud was 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries.
Yeah. So
no one has a precise date for a lot of this
No.
stuff. It's just lost in the mists of times. But it's
and
old.
a lot of it probably would have been oral tradition before that. So it probably goes back at least a century or two before it. So
So another question, a little bit off track, but following along this line. These stories are well known in Jewish circles, Elizabeth?
Yes, they are.
All right.
And they're only equal by the Elijah stories. There's heaps and heaps of folk tales about Elijah.
Okay.
Elijah just turns up. He's like that wandering Greek god or that went around or saint that read around testing whether people were really generous or, you know, whether they were mean and nasty. There's a lot of fairy tales and folk tales that have this theme. Well, Elijah turns up in rich houses and poor houses, and depending on how you treat him, you might get rewarded or you might get punished. So,
Elizabeth, would this also be is a bit like you know how we've got these stained glass windows in the churches from the New Testament? Is this a way of telling stories to people who weren't educated as much?
Yes, exactly.
And
so there's
this
this
part
big
of-
oral tradition. So you can teach things about wisdom and about being humble and about understanding your place in the order of things by telling these folk tales.
So this is where Aesop got all his tales from, I suppose. You know?
Aesop's Greek, so it's a similar sort of thing. It's sort of Proverbs and Aesop. One is the ancient Near Eastern version and one is the Greek version, if you like. And these little tales are quite ancient. They probably go back, you know, very early. And as I said, they may even go back close to the time of Jesus. We know there's tales being told around there, but they're probably oral tradition and they're not written down till a couple of centuries after that. All right, we will move on to our next section, but you can see that, you know, looking at wisdom is more complex than just what the biblical text says. There's a whole Jewish tradition around it.
Yeah, so back to scripture, the book of Proverbs, 3 times in the book of Proverbs it identifies that these proverbs are attributed to Solomon. The very first verse, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, and then it launches straight into learning about wisdom and instruction, understanding words of insight, etc., etc. Chapter 10, the Proverbs of Solomon, and again it launches straight into them. And most proverbs are in this sort of A-B part. A wise child makes a glad father, part A, but a foolish child is a mother's grief, part B. And then later on in Proverbs 25, these are other proverbs of Solomon that the officials of King Hezekiah of Judah copied. Now, Hezekiah was a number of centuries after the time of Solomon. So this is making a pitch to say they were written down at that point of time. So we have 3 references explicitly to Solomon in the book of Proverbs. We also have some wisdom psalms. You remember that there are different types of psalms, and one type of psalm is the wisdom psalm, which in this psalm, Psalm 72, is attributed to Solomon, and we know that there are various titles in the Psalms that say David or the sons of Korah or Solomon or whoever, Moses wrote this psalm. So this is one attributed to Solomon, which is a prayer for justice and righteousness for the king. So there's a number of references to Solomon in wisdom literature. But we want to put alongside of that a second picture of Solomon.
And this is a picture that you're not going to find in the Chronicles, but it's in the books of the Kings. And you can see here that Solomon was a fairly ruthless murderer, where today Adonijah, that's his older brother who's making a claim to the throne, shall be put to death. So Solomon sends his hitman, Benaniah, and Adonijah is killed, even though he's hiding, I believe, that might be Joab. One of the people he kills is actually with the Ark of the Covenant clinging onto it, and he kills him anyway.
2 of them were.
Sorry?
2 of them were.
Yes. So the king says to the priest Abiathar, go to Anoth to your state, for you deserve death. But he's only exiled and he's banished, but he mistakenly leaves his house to go track down a lost ass, I believe it is, or donkey. And Solomon says, you violated it, so he kills him. And then Joab, who supported Adonijah, decides he's going to hold on to the horns of the altar. And he's not meant to be killed according to the law if he's holding on to the horns of the altar. But Benaniah, who's not fussed about such stuff, and neither is Solomon, and they went and kill him there. And then Joab is killed and buried, and on it goes. The king, he dismisses the king, and he puts Zadok in place of Abiathar, who supported his father. So Solomon manages to ruthlessly weed out and get rid of everybody who could have a claim to the throne. And not mentioned there is Shimei, who was a relative of Saul. So any of Saul's relatives could conceivably still have a claim to the throne. So all the potential contenders that Solomon can find are removed, mostly by violent means.
Yeah, so bear in mind that David had at least 21 children that we know of, and Solomon was but one of the 21. So his climb to power was ruthless and violent.
And he's only 20 at this age. Oh, here's Shimei here.
Yeah.
And so he gets rid of him as well. You know, you did evil to my father, David, so the Lord will bring evil back on your head. And he commands Benaniah, hitman, to strike down Shimei, and he died. And then Kings tells you, in case you've missed the point, the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. And
I
again,
like that verse 45, which said Solomon will be blessed because he's the one that's got to where is it? Shall be blessed, and the throne of David shall be established before the Lord forever. Makes you shake your head, doesn't it?
Oh, well, that's the promise the Lord gave to David, and Solomon's just making sure there won't be any mishaps to this particular prophecy, and another dynasty who has the right to claim the throne go ahead and claim it. So, yes.
Elizabeth?
Yes.
You made the point that Solomon was pretty ruthless.
He was.
There's another perspective, though, I think we need to put into this. Whilst ever there were claimants to the throne, there was instability, there was wars, there was plotting. By getting rid of all these people, it gave the kingdom some stability and peace.
It did, but I would put to you that if, well, look what happened in America with Trump, and that after he lost the election and refused to concede that he'd lost the election, you had all those people invade the Capitol. I mean, should they have shot them all?
Well, maybe you could have just shot one person rather than a lot of them.
I'm not sure that you can pick and choose like that, Norman. I don't think it works that way. Right, it would have brought some stability, but there's probably other ways Solomon could have dealt with them. He could have locked them up.
I mean, if you go back in our history, English, British, Scottish, Irish, God Save the King was sung because whilst the king was on the throne, there was no instability such as happened in 1614 or something.
Oh, well, that may be true, but I'm still going to say that the British Empire was probably just as ruthless as Solomon.
Yeah, it is.
Definitely. And if the reign of the king or whoever you're talking about follows with peace and justice and equality for people, you could say, well, maybe you could get away with it. But what Solomon did later on is hardly justified by the way he established his kingdom.
Well, I think that's right. And of course, we have Solomon is the king also predicted in 1 Samuel as the one who would oppress Israel by taking their sons and daughters to be servants, the best of their fields and vineyards, the best of their herds. And it lists his daily food provisions were 30 cores of the finest flour. That's thought to be about 1,400 kilos. Wow. 60 cores of meal, 10 head of store-fed cattle, 20 of pasture-fed cattle, and 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roebucks, and choice fowl. And those who do these sort of numerical things that I don't, calculate that would feed roughly 14,000 people. So that's meant to be his daily provisions. Now, that can't possibly be coming from gifts showered on him by foreign kings every day. He's really oppressing the people. He has to be to get that sort of provision. And then, of course, lastly, his weakness for foreign women would lead him to abandon the God of his ancestry by other foreign gods. And we know from the text he's worshipping about 4 of them. And that would lead to the breakdown of the kingdom. So the northern and southern kingdoms separate and ends in Israel being conquered by Babylon, at least according to the prophets. That's what happened to him. So if we go to our next slide. So the lessons, what do we learn from the lessons from the story of Solomon? If we're talking about wisdom and we learn from things that happen, I'm going to ask you, in terms of wisdom, what are we learning from the story of Solomon? And I've got a couple of questions there. Do we fall prey to holding on to self-interested beliefs and practices? So do we look out for ourselves rather than embracing what is the common good or the best for all? Are we distracted from walking with God in favour of ruling the world to serve our individual interests? So do vested interests, in fact, rule the world rather than walking with God? Yes. Do we fall prey to holding on to these self-interested beliefs and practices?
Yes. Yes. Definitely.
There's a lot of yeses going on there. You want to unpack that a little bit?
Well, it seems to me that often we do hold on to past beliefs and practices, mainly because we don't really analyse what it means.
Yes, we don't. We just do them because they're there. And we may not look at whether or not they're actually oppressing someone. We may not look at the inheritance we're actually leaving for our children, which is what I preached on last Sunday. See if anyone in Tuggeranong remembers that. I don't believe anyone ever listens to sermons. But,
we do listen. Goodness me.
Might just stop listening now.
I have this theory, Norman, they don't really remember anything I say. But so, you know, there is the rule of wisdom in the Bible and there's the rule of the world. And Solomon ends with the rule of the world, which is about empire and self-interest and doing what actually enriches him, rather than the wisdom that he's accredited with. And we find in all the folk tales where he recognises that he needs to be humble and he recognises that he's only one part of this whole. And I guess the question we have before us then is, you know, when we think of how this relates to the church today, Solomon's decline into corruption and worship of foreign gods is a bit of a warning to those of us who would play lip service to faith but continue to oppress the vulnerable of society and continue not to actually walk in the ways of God. And that may be inadvertent and indirect, or it may be direct. And it also stands as a warning, I think, for those who would exploit the resources that God gave for all to share, because clearly Solomon's doing quite a bit of exploitation. If that story about his daily provisions is even a tenth true, that's a huge burden that he's laying on Israel in terms of what he's doing.
And I think one of the things that highlights for us that it doesn't really matter what really great things he may have done when things were going well, like the building of the temple, which I was reading about. And that was regarded as so important in the history of the people, the house of God, but it still doesn't justify his behaviour, which was unjust to people around him and what he did to the whole nation. And sometimes we get caught up in that. We excuse people's behaviour because of maybe one or two good things that they did.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true.
And we're not actually good. We like to be nice as a church. We're not always very good at calling people to account.
Yes.
Both those questions, both yes, isn't it? Clearly.
Yeah.
And you can see the way like governments work and people who profess to be Christians in government fall prey to holding on to self-interested beliefs and practices, because rather than embracing what is best for the common good.
Yes, and we got a fine example of that yesterday with our Prime Minister, and I apologise if you vote for him, because I'm about to give him a serve. When he made the speech about the Afghani refugees, and he said, even the ones that we airlift out and bring here will not be citizens of this country.
Yeah, terrible.
And that if any of them manage to escape the Taliban and come here by boat, they will not be accepted.
Oh, it was dreadful, disgusting.
I can't understand the man. He's supposed to be a Christian.
That's right. And given the plight Afghanis are in, if they can get on a boat, I say to them, good on you.
Oh, absolutely.
And if they serve the Allied forces and the Australian forces and put their lives on the line to be interpreters and infiltrate the Taliban, and they're now being told they're not worthy of actually coming and living in this country, there's something very wrong with us.
Yeah.
Shouldn't be so proud to think that we're immune from being, this being true for us as well. Should we? I think if we examine our own lives, we'll probably find that this is true for ourselves in many ways.
Yes, that's right. I'd like to put you back into groups now and to think about this, about the church in particular. In what ways is the church like the two Solomons? How does it serve the community in ways and wise, and how is it probably serving its own individual good? Because in this Bible study, we want to not just exegete it like we did in Old and New Testament. We want you to actually think about how it relates to us today. So how is the church holding on to self-interested beliefs and practices for its own survival's sake, for instance, rather than doing what is best for the whole community? I mean, you may not agree with that question, but you can talk about that. How is it being wise? How is it being like the Solomon and folk tales, but how is it just ensuring its own survival and being ruthless in its own self-interest? So I'm going to
Elizabeth, as long as you don't touch our money.
That's right. Get your filthy hands off our money. That's correct.
And don't touch our building.
Oh no, our buildings are very, very important. Don't do that.
Man.
All right, off you go into your breakout rooms to discuss this fascinating topic. See what you come up with.
Yes.
What did you find out? What did you discuss? Anything you'd like to share?
Well, so Susan brought up something interesting. I mean, we discussed the issues of the money, the time slot, and the building, but which are all sort of. But the other one is she brought up, what's happening with sexual abuse in the churches, and how people, the churches didn't want to acknowledge that,
didn't they? It was hidden.
It was hidden. It was hidden for many, many years, and the cries and voices of victims and their families went unheeded largely.
Yes. And as Susan said, this was because the church wanted to keep it hidden because it wanted to preserve itself and its perception.
The reputation of the institution was what was paramount, rather than the suffering of the people.
And we also brought up the approach to having people from the LGBTIQ group, or it was basically you could be welcome to our church providing you think our way.
That's
Yes.
Right. Yes, I raised that.
Yeah. And one of the wonderful things, of course, is Tuggers is our rainbow congregation is getting so big. There was 28 there last time.
Wow.
And 3 of them just walked in off the street.
Oh, that's great.
So its word is getting around, and our website's helping with that. I mean, this is an aside, but, this has been a really good space for some of those people. There's one transgender lady that's come in there, and she was in ICU for 4 days because she attempted suicide. But she's now asked to become a member of our church because she was so entranced with the welcome she got and the feeling that she belonged and she wasn't sinful.
Oh, wonderful.
So that was really, really good that she felt that way.
But not wanting to take away from that story, Elizabeth, one of the things that troubles me about our church, the Uniting Church, as a big organisation, is that we've still got to, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we couldn't make up our minds about which liturgy we would have for marriage. So we've still, to my knowledge, got 2 liturgies, one that's inclusive and one that is not. So we still have a divided church about, what we will accept and what we will not. So I find that troubling too.
It probably is troubling. And there are folk that wanted to adhere to what they saw as the traditional definition of marriage. And I mean, they're actually quite a minority. They really are a minority. They're loud, but they're small. And you've got the rest of us who are saying, well, we're not doing that. We're going to actually accept and marry same-gendered people. But there is still that divide there. At least in the Uniting Church, mostly we've hung on to being together. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but we're still together as a church. And having to live together does force you to hear another part of the story and another person's point of view, so you're not in an echo chamber. And that's not a bad thing, even if you're in violent disagreement.
Yeah, because that's really a strength if you're able to be together, even though you understand, you think differently. I think that's quite important, rather than that sort of ruthlessness that everybody needs to adhere.
Yes, we don't have to assassinate everyone who disagrees with us, aka Solomon.
No,
we don't want to go down Solomon's line, do we?
No,
that's right.
So follow his example, but don't follow all of his example.
That's right. Any other thoughts people want to share?
I guess one of the things that came to me out of this is we do like the gentle Jesus, meek and mild, but let's not be too interested in the whip and the overturning of tables.
I think you're right, Norman, and especially in the Gospel of John, when you read it there, Jesus sits down and actually constructs an elaborate twined whip, which is a Roman whip. And I did not know that till I looked at the Greek and found that it's specifically a Roman whip that he's making. And he has to sit down and contemplate for a good hour as making this thing, because they're not straight out easy to make. You've got to braid them in a certain way. He's making this thing and he knows exactly what he's going to do. This isn't a great knee-jerk outburst of temper like we like to think it is. Jesus walks in and just loses his marbles because he sees it. It's very calculated. He sits down, he spends an hour at least making this twisted whip, this braided whip, and then he goes to town with it. So I'm not sure what that's telling us, but maybe righteous anger is a thing. This wasn't a spontaneous thing that he does. It's quite deliberate. And he's using a Roman instrument, which I'm not sure what the writer of John is saying by that, but I'm sure he's saying something, because he's the only one who uses that term. The synoptics don't use that term.
And it's very calculated, isn't it?
It is incredibly calculated in the Gospel of John, incredibly calculated, where he thinks about it. And he has to be thinking about it as he's sitting there braiding his whip. So, yes.
Elizabeth, I speak as a former church council chairperson and would confess that there were occasions where I went for consensus and harmony rather than perhaps, let's take a stand on principle. And that's very easy to do because we all like harmony, peace, fellowship.
It is easy to do, and we want to be nice in the church. And that might sound cynical, but it's not meant to be. We really do. And we want to give people the benefit of the doubt, and we want to try and work together. So we don't always maybe take the stand that we need to take and say, well, this isn't actually a good idea, or this is a good idea, depending on what that be, and actually put our foot down. And I'm sure my church council will tell you that I have various dummy spits at times along those lines and get stroppy.
Not alone.
Did Bill Lang's hand go up?
But it takes a long time to get to a point where you can do that. It really does, because we do want to be nice. And we don't want to upset people or ruffle feathers or rock boats. And we probably should give more thought to who we are as an institution, and as an institution who we may be inadvertently oppressing. Anyway, you're all going to get this wondrous handout, which I've put together, that we weren't sure who was going to be in what sessions and who is coming. So it's 3 pages. It's a study guide. You'll get one every week, and you didn't get this one in advance, I'm sorry, but you will get it afterwards. And you'll find a set of questions at the end in a little summary about what we've talked about with Solomon that you can think about, or take to your small groups if you're in small groups. And that you'll get one of those every week that'll give you some background and some notes and some guidelines for what we're going to be doing each week with the particular passages that we are looking at. So we're going to move on to our last bit, which is just a bit of a preview of what we're going to be doing in the coming weeks, where we'll be following the lectionary and the text that the lectionary puts in from the wisdom literature.
So the wisdom literature comprises some of the Psalms. Well, the Psalms is usually included in wisdom literature as the 3rd major section of Hebrew scripture. And a number of the Psalms are wisdom Psalms. Then there's the whole book of Proverbs, which is just those pithy little 2-line proverbs all the way through. Then there's the book of Job, and we're going to be spending 3 weeks on Job because this is one of Elizabeth's favourite parts of the Bible.
And it's a long book. It has
42
chapters.
42 chapters, so that's 14 chapters each week. We're not going to be looking at all the chapters, but that's the... And then what the Jews call in their scriptures, they call the 5 scrolls. And these are short books which are lumped together. They're not part of Torah, the law. They're not part of Nevi'im, the prophets. They're part of Ketuvim, the wisdom literature, the writings. So that's the Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. So they're the Old Testament books, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, and the 5 scrolls that are part of the wisdom literature. But we're at the end of this course, we're going to be looking at what happened in Jewish life after the Old Testament and how some of the literature that was written in what's called the intertestamental period then influenced parts of the New Testament. So that's where we're heading. Wisdom is concerned with these 4 things, wisdom literature as a whole. It's concerned with everyday life. It's really about the wise things to do in living life every day. It doesn't make claims to revealed truth. When you read the narratives in the early parts of Hebrew Scripture, Old Testament, you see that the story says that God spoke, God gave Moses the law, God said this, God did that. That's revealed truth. The prophets in the second major section of Hebrew Scriptures constantly say, this is the word of the Lord, thus spoke the Lord. And the prophets speak on behalf of and conveying the message of God. So that's revealed truth. Rather, wisdom is more concerned to be descriptive rather than revelatory, to describe life as it is, to explore through proverbs and sayings and other ways, short stories, to explore what's the wise way to live life. So the authority is not on revelation, it's not on scripture, it's not on tradition, it's not on the heritage, but rather it's how the heritage, how that tradition works in the current situation. So observation is really important for the authors of the wisdom. And of course, undergirding all of this is the fear of the Lord, the reverence of God, the awe and worshipful attitude to God. So wisdom literature is rooted in reverence and a commitment to God. They're the sort of overarching characteristics of the literature that we'll be looking at. We thought it might be just have a teaser about some of the books. The book of Proverbs, apart from the ant, what are the well-known proverbs that you know in this book?
Lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge God, and He will direct your paths. Something along those lines.
Okay.
Well, that's a pretty good memory, Margaret.
A smooth answer turneth away wrath.
Yep. That's an interesting one for you to remember, Bill, too.
Probably things like a stitch in time saves none. All those things learned in primary school.
Yes. There are no of those pithy sayings that come from the book of wisdom. There's actually a very famous one that's attributed to Proverbs that actually isn't in Proverbs, well, not in the form. Does anyone know what that is?
Is that A Fool and His Money? Was that one?
A Fool and His Money, no. It's spare the rod and spoil the child.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's often thought to be in the book of Proverbs, and it's kind of there, but not in that form.
No, not quite like that.
No.
Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
I think that's actually in the law rather than Proverbs, though it's become a well-known saying. And they're all looking in their Proverbs now. I can see that.
We're checking.
We're trying to, yeah.
Oh, that one I remember well, the one I said, yeah.
Pride goes before a fall.
Yes, there's one.
Yeah.
A fool and his money is soon parted.
A lot of things have come into our language from the book of Proverbs.
Yep.
And not only will you meet wisdom in Proverbs, you're also going to meet another female character in Proverbs known as Folly. And she's wisdom's kind of dark twin. And you really don't want to mess with Folly.
She comes from Paris, does she?
So, yes.
All right. We're also going to spend some time with Ecclesiastes. What famous passage is in?
There is a time for every purpose.
Season there is a turn. Yes.
Yes. The seekers.
Yeah.
Yeah. The birds.
The birds.
The birds, not the seekers.
Yeah, it wasn't the seekers who sang it. They may have sung it, but they didn't write it.
Something about they that go down to the sea in ships.
That's Ecclesiasticus, Norman, not Ecclesiastes.
That's an apocryphal book.
Is in the Bible, Ecclesiastes.
There is a time for every purpose under heaven.
Yes,
that's
Time
it.
to fall,
Season.
time to die, time to
live and a
plan,
time to die.
time
Yeah.
to live.
Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what the day will bring.
Yes.
Right. And of course, the famous everything is just wind. Though you may have that translated differently in your books, but that's pretty much what it's saying. Everything is futile. Everything is just wind. Vanity, vanity.
All is vanity.
Vanity,
Yeah.
vanity, yes.
Mm.
So there's quite a famous things have come out of this book as well.
Mm.
Okay.
And the other one that I like too is that two are better than one, and then it goes on to talk about the third strand that makes the unbreakable rope.
Yes.
And that's where they got the whipping rope from the Jesus.
That's right.
Yeah.
So Jesus is sitting down making an ecclesiastical whip.
Yeah.
Okay. So some of the Psalms, we'll probably look mostly at the wisdom Psalms.
Yes. So the very first psalm is really a wisdom psalm. Blessed is the one who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but delights in the law of the Lord. And on God's law, that person meditates day and night.
Day and night. Yeah. Mm.
John, I'm interested in, like, when you're in that little collection of things here about wisdom, you say describes life as it is rather than revealed truth.
Yep.
And yet early on in that little video, it talked about this being like a moral law of the universe. And doesn't that suggest that it is something external like that, rather than just being a collection of describing life?
Well, it's about how the divine permeates everyday life is the way I would probably put it, Bill. And that's why the law is what it is. And you might think a lot of the law is sort of scratchy, mundane stuff, and why would you bother? But it's about making the mundane sacred. So this is really, it's not about revealed truth in the way the prophets revealed truth, but it's about how the divine permeates the everyday and how that manifests and what it looks like when it manifests.
Mm.
And wisdom is there, and you can encounter her because she's very public. As when we come to look at her, you'll see that she's a very subversive figure, and she's the opposite of what you'd expect in the culture. And she's just available. And if you avail yourself of her and you follow her ways, then that thread they showed in the video, that's sort of the thread of the divine stitching everything together, you tap into that and you become part of that tapestry of, I suppose in some ways it's intuitively almost following the way of the Lord, which is the way of wisdom, which is how you go about your everyday life and what attitude you bring to that. Does that make sense?
Yep.
You always do, Elizabeth. Yes.
Now, was that necessary, Bill Lang? Honestly.
Next week, folks, we are going to be looking at the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs. And I've just done a quick count. There's 8 chapters in the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs, 117 verses all told. So I don't think it's too much of a stretch to ask you to read, please, the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, for next week in advance. We will actually
let me mute Enid's dog. There we go. Try again, John.
We'll actually be looking at
yourself.
We'll be focusing on this book, which is a relatively short book, and we'll be looking at a number of key passages in it and thinking about what it says to us and what it has said to people in the history of interpretation. So that's next week's delight, the Song of Songs. So
And
please read it.
It is a delight. And if you can read it all and get the context, it'll make much more sense when we focus on specific parts of it.
John, are you going to send out the tune?
The what?
The tune. Are you going to send it out?
The tune to the song. Yeah, well, no.
Norman's making dad jokes. Shame
Yes,
on
I
you,
know.
Norman.
He has a huge repertoire.
And then just as a reminder, you may have seen in the email that we will be spending some time with different parts of Proverbs. We'll be looking at Proverbs 1, comes on the lectionary in a couple of weeks. We'll be looking at Ecclesiastes 1 week, Proverbs 31, and that's a really important passage there. We'll be looking at the story of Esther. We'll be spending 3 weeks on Job, 2 weeks on Ruth. And then in the last week, we will have a look at a few passages from the Wisdom of Solomon and Ben Sirach, also known as Ecclesiasticus, and seeing how that influences passages in Hebrews, Colossians, John in the New Testament.
And they're apocryphal books, if you aren't aware of those, that if you have a Catholic Bible with the Apocrypha, you will be able to access those. And Proverbs 31, trivia, who can tell me what it's about?
That's about the men sitting at the gates of the city discussing the law.
I didn't ask you.
Good wife.
The wife, yes. That's right. It's all, Proverbs 31 is very famous because it starts off with a lot of translations like a capable wife, a good wife, a wise wife, etc. who can find. So that's Proverbs 31 we're looking at. And John's quite right. At the end of it, it says her husband praises her in the town gates because obviously that's where he's spending his time gossiping while she's doing it.
As in if I were a rich man.
Well,
Yeah, he could sit at the gates and
I think they're fairly well off this
problems
family.
that would cross a rabbi's eyes.
Oh, well, that's where they did the judging. The elders sat at the gate and people brought their problems there and they ruled on law and various disputes and things like that. So, you know, when I sarcastically observed they were gossiping at the gates, they must have done some work sometime, but they were talking about the weighty matters of law, presumably. All right, folks, thank you for your attendance here today.
Thank you.
I hope you've got a grasp. This isn't going to be the sort of rigorous kind of exegetical study that we have done in Old and New Testament. We hope to always have a component where you can think about how it relates to you and in your faith journey in your church. And you will get this handout that I've got here that will be sent out to you. And when I've completed one for next week, you'll get that as well in advance. So
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Everybody,
Bye,
have a good
everybody.
week.
See you next
Bye.
week.
See you all next
See
week.
ya.
Bye.
Lectionary, what time, Elizabeth? At 12?
Sorry?
Lectionary Cafe?
Yes, Lectionary Cafe is on at 12. So if you don't want to come to Lectionary Cafe, I'll get you to take yourself out. And if you want to come to Lectionary Cafe, stick around or go and get something to eat and a cup of tea. And we'll see you at 12 to talk about the lectionary readings.
Right.
So you better explain for people that...
Oh, for those of you who don't know what Lectionary Cafe is over lunch, we sit down and we just talk about the 4 lectionary readings and there's no preparation required. We read them out loud because that's how they would have been understood and heard in an oral culture. And then we just talk about what comes to our minds about them. And we ask questions of each other and we just discuss them generally. So that runs from 12 o'clock generally to around 1:30. So that's on every Thursday for those who feel that they have a pressing need to know more about the lectionary readings and discuss them.